I'm sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Accidents happen in the best families, and this wasn't the fault of the phantom lawnmower or even the phantom dog, but of my complete laptop disaster has stopped completely working. So I'm staring at a very small mobile with a medium dog licking water by me. So back here we are again, once again for RSM Live. I've forgotten what the number of this one is. I think it's about number 55. And I'm very pleased that I mean, it's quite interesting actually that we tell people beforehand who our guests are. We asked us some questions to come, but people are so obsessed with the vaccines today that all the questions that come in today are actually about the vaccines, which should be wonderful, except that our guest today is Professor Cliff Stott, who is a most remarkable social psychologist and sociologist, and he's an expert on police and all matters policing, but not vaccines. So you'll just have to wait for that. Now then, so who is he? Well, he's a professor of social psychology, I believe, at Keele, where you run a large unit with a wonderful acronym name, which I've now forgotten because I don't have my notes, but I remember thinking that was terribly clever. You also work for the English Football League on matters of policing as well, where you also run a unit. You are very well published in crowd psychology, riots, etc., but very recently you've actually joined SPIBE, with that wonderful acronym there, where you are part of SAGE. But Cliff, first of all, before we go any further though, I'm going to ask you this. So 2004 finds you in Lisbon, am I right?
That is correct, Simon. Pleasure to be here with you.
Thank God for that. Yes, we're normally a bit more organised than this, but there we go. Now, it just so happens I was in Lisbon at that time as well, also watching the football, 2004, the Euros. What a fantastic time it was. And I've only just realised that one of the reasons it was a really enjoyable occasion, which it was because of what you had been doing there. So tell us what you'd been up to.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Simon. I saw I think on your Twitter feed that you have the misfortune of being a Chelsea fan. So
we were getting on so well, Cliff, until you said that.
Watch the football. Well, we've been working. I mean, I've been following England for several years. I mean, I started following England as a PhD researcher to look at public disorder, rioting in a football context, and very quickly began to recognise that a lot of the trouble around England games wasn't about English hooligans, it was about overly aggressive policing. And we've been working across an extended period of time. By that time, we've been funded for 4 years by the UK government to build a relationship with the police in Portugal to try to help them to rethink the policing approach around the tournament based on our work on policing and crowd psychology. And the success of the experience that you lived through was in part because of the successes that we achieved in that regard, in terms of helping the police to effectively tone down the policing so that it was less likely to make the mistakes of the past.
And give us a clue as what you actually did to make yourselves invisible, as it were, because I barely remember any police at all. What I do remember was lots and lots of quite pissed French fans, but all of us sharing bars and having a great time. Yeah, what was your magic ingredient?
Well, I think it was exactly that, really. It was the invisibility of policing. It wasn't that they weren't there. They had significant policing resources, but we had convinced them to take what we call a graded approach, in the sense that you have a very low-profile policing presence. So a lot of the police that were there were actually in plain clothes, so you wouldn't notice them, but they were monitoring the situation and watching things develop. So that if a more forceful intervention was needed, it was more proportionate and more accurately targeted. So it was more subtle. It wasn't indiscriminate. It didn't lead to an action against the crowd as a whole, which is part of the dynamics through which minor confrontations escalate up into the big riots that we'd seen up to that point. So it's about introducing a level of subtlety, I suppose, is the easiest way to say it.
Subtlety and policing. I'm delighted to hear that they do go together. Okay, so all right. Well, that's your background to all this, and then earlier this year you found yourself on SAGE, presumably advising on matters like this, public order, policing, etc. Now, if we look back on the history of pandemics, the truth is public order has always been a major problem. I mean, problem isn't quite the right word. We're talking about murder, pogroms, killing, discrimination, all sorts of things that go on. But there's something about plagues that doesn't really go well with the body politic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think historically, as you point out, that one of the predominant features of any major epidemic or pandemic is that there is almost invariably some escalations in confrontation, and where one looks historically and drills down into the detail of that, you can see very, very similar patterns to those that we identify in historical rioting more generally. And they relate very clearly to the kinds of dynamics we now understand to play the primary role in why disorder comes about. And that's very much about the exercise of power. So, of course, in a pandemic, states start to exercise extreme forms of power. And that the relationship between the state and the citizenry is dynamic and revolves around really important things like freedom of assembly, expression. And one of the factors that seems to be one of the big trigger points in riots associated to pandemics is related to deaths and funerals. And the excess death rates and how people are allowed or not to manage the funeral process seems to be a key catalyst in where these senses of illegitimacy that feed into the outbreak of disorder.
We were talking about the history of the pandemics, and you were saying that funerals are a particular problem.
Yeah, a particular catalyst, because they're the points at which communities come to perceive a sense of illegitimacy in the extended level of state control. And I think, again, that's a key point about rioting in pandemics. That rioting in pandemics is not random. Rioting is not some mindless explosion of frustration. It's driven by particular dynamics. And we know that those dynamics revolve around perceptions of legitimacy and illegitimacy in particular. Creates the conditions for widespread disorder to develop, and that's incredibly important. We need to manage that through this pandemic in the UK, and that's really why I got involved in SPI-B.
Now, I mean, you have to say though that we have, if we look around, we haven't seen that, have we? We haven't had food riots. We haven't had attacks on minority groups. We haven't had any real particular breakdowns of law and order, more than one might expect. We've done pretty well. Why is that?
Well, we have. I would add to that the word yet. Okay. It's not over. It's not over yet.
No, that's true.
But I think the other thing to recognise is that we have. Okay, there have been serious outbreaks of violent confrontation in specific areas. We saw quite a lot of it in the summer around the policing of what the police call unlicensed music events, or UMEs, raves and so on. Quite a bit of confrontation there. We've seen confrontation in certain parts of the country, on certain estates. There have been quite serious incidents of disorder. We haven't actually seen it in the media, so we've been blind to it, as it were. But also, I like to think that at some level, the advice that we've been giving has been helping to manage the situation away from inadvertently creating the conditions of disorder in certain locations.
Okay, well, I want to come back to that, but let's just take a look at other places for a little bit and see how they've been doing before we come back to the UK. Yesterday on the news was some film of French police acting fairly officiously in the Bois de Boulogne, checking ID cards. I'm sure you've seen that footage of French police beating up a music producer, and they certainly have a much higher kinetic rate, don't they, in France? I mean, right from the start of the pandemic, the differences between us and them was very, very dramatic in terms of cautions and fines being issued, stopping of people in the street, etc. So a different style of policing there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see before the pandemic that certain countries have a cultural style about their policing that's very different from our own. And the French, the Italians, the Spanish, very notorious in their use of what we would see as heavy-handedness. And it's no surprise to us that in the early stages of the pandemic, then you get rioting in Paris, because this style of policing carries with it the inherent risk of precipitating the conditions of riot. That's why we think it's such a bad idea to use it. But sometimes certain cultural contexts, the police aren't really ready for that message, even now.
Certainly, if you go and watch football in each of those three countries you've made, it can sometimes be quite an unpleasant experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, as an experienced travelling football fan yourself, you'll know very clearly what it's like to be an away English fan in any three of those countries.
Yes, no, that's true. And but it's fascinating also that in France, of course, the influence of French police on ours is actually very profound. I didn't really know this until I was just reading about you, actually, but we owe our tradition of policing. Let's go back to 1829, and Sir Robert Peel coming back from a visit to France and being fairly appalled by what he'd seen about the French police. What happens next?
Well, of course, we get the so-called Peelian principles, the birth of the Metropolitan Police, and so on. But I think as well that the contrasting episode was referred to as Peterloo, the Peterloo Massacre.
Mm-hmm.
And we were coming to a point in our history where the state control through the use of the military was becoming unsustainable in an emerging context of political enlightenment, as it were, liberalism. So there had to be a different model, and the core to that model is of the public, by the public, for the public. The idea of recruiting people from the communities that you're trying to police in order to create a culture of self-regulation within those communities. That's the concept at the core of what it means to be a police constable in the UK. Mm-hmm. And we still have that core tradition intact in the so-called British model of policing.
And you talked out, I thought you were being slightly dismissive of the Peelian principles, but perhaps not.
No, absolutely far from it. I'm a great adherent of the Peelian principles. Right. I think there's obviously a little bit of a kind of cliche misunderstanding about Robert Peel and so on. But the core principles of Peelian models of policing, the British model of policing, the so-called model of policing by consent has the legitimacy of policing at its heart, and that in a sense is what we try to push for. That legitimacy in policing is absolutely fundamental, both in terms of effectiveness but also in terms of maintaining what it means to be a democracy.
And meanwhile in France, of course, they didn't go down that path. They were influenced by other people. I've got a copy of Le Bon and his book on crowds somewhere, which regards them as being, he'd been obviously hadn't been through the French Revolution, been through the Commune, and really didn't like crowds. Would be an understatement, I think. A kind of different view of how crowds work to how you now view them.
True enough, but those ideas that were introduced by Le Bon are still hard at work in the contemporary sphere. I mean, we just published a paper on the policing of the protests in Hong Kong in 2019. One of the points that we make about that paper is the way in which the political establishment in Hong Kong draw upon a rhetorical analysis of the disorder in Le Bonian terms, the idea of the mad mob, the mob psychology, and easy exploitation of that mob psychology by outside agitators is the justification that the state uses then to suppress the crowd. And that's the point about Le Bonian theory. It's not there because it's valid, it's there because it serves a useful ideological function in legitimizing repression, and that's why it still gets deployed.
But you and Steve Riker, who was your who you did your PhD with, I think, have a different view though. You have a, what should we call it, a Reichian view, if I want to put it like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of what goes on. And tell us why your view differs and why it's so important in the work that you do and the advice that you give.
Well, I suppose the core of the approach is that we argue that people don't lose rationality in the crowd. They don't become part of an irrational mob psychology. They reorient to a rationality that's defined by a group identity. And the fact that crowd action is meaningful for people helps us, first of all, to explain what they're going to do, but it also helps us to predict what they might do in the future. And what we also know by taking that approach is that there are certain ways in which the dynamics of intergroup interaction during a crowd event, particularly around issues of legitimacy and power, function to change that identity in ways that can precipitate confrontation. But the advantage of looking at it in that way is that we can then start to predict, and we can also start to shape police interventions in ways that don't inadvertently interact with those dynamics to produce escalations in confrontation. So it's not just a theory, it's a really useful tool. And that's what we were doing in Portugal when we were working with the police to apply that knowledge to de-escalate conflict in a football context, which, as you recall, at that time was a really serious problem wherever England fans went. Yeah,
we just sat drinking Vino Verde. Now, on the subject of crowds, someone's asked Caroline Endersby talking about a new dynamic that happens now, though, that wasn't present in Lisbon or in London until more recently. This is the problem of crowds who will not self-distance. In other words, are in COVID terms, engaging in very risky behaviour. Now, that must be a new dynamic to policing.
Yeah, absolutely. I said one of the core things about the pandemic is the way in which it starts to create a context in which the police start to police things they've never policed before. You know, freedom of movement. You know, remember at the beginning of the lockdown, you weren't even allowed out of your house for more than once a day. So now we're in the territory where there is this strong need to manage people's behavior in ways that prevents the transmission of the virus, because at this time it's our only weapon for doing that. And that raises the question then is how do we achieve that? Do we achieve it through imposing enforcement and deterrence and creating laws and punishments? Or do we draw on a different way of understanding how to manage people's psychology that helps them to police the situation themselves? Go back to Simon's point there about earlier on about Peelian principles. Well, Peelian principles carry with them the idea that communities self-regulate, and that's the kind of thing that we need to achieve here, to help people regulate themselves. Now, if they don't do that, then there's a question of why and how can we get in there. But as I say, the question here is, do we take an enforcement approach? And my argument is that doing so is counterproductive.
I take those points, but I'm not sure you quite answered Carol's question about, do you think the police should be intervening? Well, I don't quite know how the police would do it, but what kind of practical lessons are there from what you've said? I mean, we've seen various styles of policing, even in the last, we've seen police actually trying to get engaged and other times not.
Well, yeah, I suppose it depends what you mean by intervention.
Yeah, true.
If we're going to ask the police to intervene, we have to say, well, what is that intervention going to look like?
Yeah.
But, certainly, do we want a style of policing where police get into the mix of those crowds and try to promote an environment where self-regulation takes place? But let's be clear, those crowds are going on all over the place. I mean, you will recall we've just recently seen crowds on Oxford Street going shopping. Well, they're not socially distant either, are they? No. So why all of a sudden are we focused on BLM protests or other types of protests and saying you're the problem, and at the same time ignoring all of these other kinds of gatherings, as if there's only one type of gathering that's a problem? The issue here isn't specific to crowds. It is an issue across society as a whole. And how do we create an environment where people socially distant or physically distant when they are in close proximity, and what can we do to help them to manage those relationships around them in ways that don't violate that issue of distance? The question I think I'm being asked here, Simon, is what role is of the police in that? Yeah. And what role police intervention? Well, that's a complex issue, isn't it? As I say, it goes back to the style of intervention. Are we talking about police officers going into that crowd and speaking with people and therefore increasing the density and possibly transmitting the disease themselves? Or are we talking about squads of police officers going up to those crowds with weaponry and saying, move or I will arrest you? Well, how is that functional? How does that help manage the disease in ways that don't lead to the violations that we're supposed to be trying to prevent?
Yeah, I take your point and you make it very well. Well, explain to us then, the police talk about the 4 E's approach that they have. Do you want to just take us through that?
Yeah, so the idea there is underpinned by a criminological theory, procedural justice theory, where the idea is that the police, if they act with perceived fairness, create a perception in the public of the legitimacy of policing, which motivates people to comply with their authority and comply with their instruction in a way that allows for self-regulation. So it comes from the work of Tom Tyler. And why do people obey the law? Well, people obey the law not because they're frightened of a deterrent, but because they believe in the legitimacy and the moral obligation to obey the law. So the route to getting compliance is to create a context of legitimacy and fairness so people regulate themselves. And the 4 E's approach is part of the tactical framework through the police, through which the police can apply that theory. So the idea is that you engage people, you explain to them, you encourage them to comply before you move to the 4th E, which is enforcement. So if you tried all of those things and they failed, then and only then do you fine them? Do you arrest them? Do you use force to deal with the situation? So the 4 E's is built around a set of principles that are quite similar to the kind of policing you experienced in Portugal.
You were behind them both, I would have thought. And in fact, the number of enforcements that we've done is very low, isn't it? I mean, when you actually look at the absolute numbers that have been issued, it's remarkably low as a percentage of our population.
Yeah, comparatively to places like France, yes, and Italy and so on. Yeah, so much, much higher, much more draconian. And the key thing to recognise with this is that it's made absolutely no difference. So you can go to countries like France where they've had heavy enforcement, have not managed the disease any better than places like the UK where there's been low levels of enforcement. So what it shows us straight away is that at societal level, enforcement, the style of enforcement doesn't really make any difference. So there's a key issue there.
But it does make a difference, doesn't it, in the aftermath? I mean, I'm asking you actually, I assume it does.
Well, I meant
as to how we will react to each other and how we will interact with the police depending on how we behaved and they behaved during the crisis. So yeah, it's not inconsequential.
No, very consequential in those terms. I meant just in terms of management of the transmission of the virus. So the negative consequences of a heavy enforcement approach, particularly if that had been adopted in the UK, will be long term. And let's not lose sight of one of the problems here when we start talking about policing is we tend to fall back on generalities. We talk about the police. Let's recognise that we've got multiple police forces in the UK. And there is a great deal of variability in policing from one force area to another. And that's important to recognise too. But as you point out, Simon, that a key issue in the pandemic is moving into an environment where enforcement has been required to stop us from doing things that we would normally expect to be able to do, and then living with the long-term consequences of that after the pandemic for police public relations, particularly in areas that have troubled relationships with the police, because those areas have tended to be the ones that have suffered the most from the pandemic as well.
Yeah. And I think you have twice the rate of enforcement if you're BME, still much higher in certain parts of France, I know that. But still, areas that have had trouble policing get more trouble rather than less during this kind of, during a pandemic, basically. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, absolutely is. And also you're twice as likely to die from the disease in those very same areas.
Yes.
When we ask ourselves, well, why are people more exposed to risk in those areas? It comes back to inequality. They work in precarious employment. They have poorer health rates as well as poor socioeconomic demographics around those areas. They're in professions where they have higher likelihood of physical contact and proximity, bus drivers and so on, taxi drivers. All these kinds of things factor together to produce what are effectively hotspots of inequality that's measured in terms of high rates of death and transmission from the pandemic as well. So if you throw policing, aggressive policing into those areas, you are absolutely creating the conditions where widespread confrontation is far more likely to develop.
And another question's come up, I'm sure you've been asked before. It's our old friend Dominic Cummings, who does appear on a few occasions in these webinars, but with your own experience, the police as far as I understand it, let it be known their displeasure at what had happened. Do you think that had any impact on policing? Made it more difficult for them, or what?
I do. I don't think we can ever look at single factor explanations, but I think things work together in particular ways to undermine trust and confidence, and therefore legitimacy in the control measures and the way in which they were policed. So I think it's widely understood now that the Cummings affair was the point at which the sense of all in it together began to break down a little, and there was an emerging sense of us and them. And I think that what we see there is a consequence where people start to see us and them in terms of, well, it's one law for us and one law for them. And I think what that feeds is the potentiality for people to see enforcement against us as far more illegitimate because you're not policing them in the same way. And it's this dynamic of perceived illegitimacy that we know to be fundamental to why riots begin to happen.
But I mean, another impact of that was almost the opposite. Certainly some of the work we were doing down here was showing that people did not react by saying, well, if he can get away with it, so can I. It was more like almost they needed less policing because they said, well, I don't trust anyone now. I'm just going to stay indoors till I think it's safe because I don't trust the government anymore. And that it wasn't so much levels of compliance that changed, it was levels of fear that increased.
Potentially, yeah. I think there's all sorts of things going on, and these are occurring across a temporal sequence, aren't they?
Yeah.
So we see the end of lockdown. There was quite a sort of sense of being liberated. Do you remember that newspaper? I think it was a Daily Mail headline, Independence Day, and there's suddenly this sort of uplift in people going out. And what was interesting from us from a policing analysis point of view was at that point it effectively became impossible to enforce anything other than flagrant violations of the law and the guidance. So when one puts that in concrete terms, what are those flagrant violations other than large-scale public assembly? Large groups getting together that become obviously a violation of the regulations. So unlicensed music events, raves, any form of large house party and so on. But when one looks at that, what we're talking about is public order policing. We're talking about management of crowds. So this is going across the summer, then we go back into lockdown and so on and so forth. So we've got quite a complex array of different factors intervening psychologically and socially into how people are reacting to the control measures and to the situation. And that hasn't gone away. Here we are just a couple of days away from a major dispute about whether we can celebrate Christmas or not together in that 5 days. Can we lift the lid? Now, what's going to happen in those 5 days? What's going to happen after the 5 days? What's going to happen at New Year? These are all sort of major issues that relate to people's perceptions of the fairness of these control measures.
And your prediction is what? What is going to happen?
Well, it's going to be very, very difficult, obviously, through the Christmas period. But I'm probably going to be putting my neck on a chopping block here. And my position has always been, you're never going to enforce it anyway. So why try? Why create the conditions when you're criminalizing lots of people who are ultimately going to come together because they believe that they have the need to do that? And I think that the current situation is the situation that is correct for us because it's impossible to enforce that. Can we really seriously imagine a scenario where we are creating a context where the police have the right to go in to people's houses to break up a gathering around the Christmas dinner table?
No, your point is perfectly well made, of course, and they won't do that. Just remind us of what they can do, of course, because people seem to think that actually the police have the right to come into your house whenever they want, but that's not quite true, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, it's a really troubling question, Simon. I think, I can't even pretend that I've got an answer to it, to be perfectly honest with you. And I think that's true of the police as well, that we've been doing some observations looking at policing operations in the situation of COVID. And it's very, very clear from the research that we're doing through observations and indeed some of the survey work that we're doing that the police also struggle to understand how to enforce these regulations. And it has a big effect on what we call officer self-legitimacy. that the ambiguity about what is and isn't allowed is so profound that people are finding themselves in situations where both police and the public don't know what is actually allowable in that context. And I don't know if you're anything like me, but I've kind of given up, and I'm thinking, look, I just don't know. So I'm just not going out because I just don't know.
Yeah, and yes, I think that's one of them. You know, people talk about non-compliance, but all the work James Rubin and co has done has shown it's not non-compliance, just they don't know what it is they're supposed to be complying with, which I think is quite true. But let's talk a little bit then about compliance, and now not about the police, but of us and this concept you have of normative compliance. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I suppose normative compliance is a concept that grows out of procedural justice theory, and it's a way of understanding the effects of policing. So on the one hand, you've got this concept called instrumental compliance, and the idea there is that people don't break the law because they're frightened of punishment. So you're going to get sent to prison, there's an enforcement regime, and you'll comply with the law not because you want to, but because you know if you violate the law, you've had it. Whereas normative compliance is the idea that people comply with the law as a form of social norm, that they see the law as legitimate and they feel an obligation to obey that law as a function of that sense of moral obligation. So normative compliance is a way of understanding why people conform to the law. But I also think that it's important to address the language that we use here: obedience, compliance. It creates a sense of passiveness on the part of the citizen. But I also think that normative compliance conveys a sense of agency, that we make choices about whether or not we break the law. And what we have is a decision to adhere to the guidance rather than comply with authority.
Okay. But that also then drifts on into the other question of I don't know what your word is for it, but the way in which has definitely changed, and we've been plotting this as well, the way in which people now are more and more enforcing kind of, and what's the word, I'm not compliance, but orthodoxy, as it were, on others. The rise of vigilantism, perhaps, we haven't quite got there yet, but the COVID marshals, Priti Patel saying that it was perfectly okay to snoop on your neighbors and things like that. And actually, that became, or is, the numbers for that are quite revealing, aren't they? The number of people who have been, contacting the police what on the surface seems like informing on their neighbors and things like that. We seem to be split on this, don't we, as a population?
Yeah, this was one of the first effects on the police in the early stages of the pandemic, was that their call centers got overwhelmed by people calling, oh, there's my neighbor, blah, 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 blah. So I did some really interesting work with one police force who drilled down into the details of what was going on there. And it was really interesting because they worked out that the majority of the calls were actually, when they investigated who was being reported on, were key workers who were going out of their house on a regular basis because they had to go to work. And what it started to expose was how little neighbours know about one another. Mm. And of course, there was some violation, but those violations were driven predominantly by two things. One was mental health issues, so underlying vulnerabilities where people just couldn't bear to be in their house and had to go out to more than twice a day just because of mental health issues. And then there was also previous hotspots of criminality. So that certain groups, organised crime groups and so on, who were basically the same as they were before the pandemic in terms of presenting problems of antisocial behaviour, low-level criminality and so on. So, but the vast bulk of that calling was for key workers. And as I say, it exposes some really troubling things about the way that we get on with it.
Does a little, doesn't it? Yeah. I didn't know that. I was thinking of an example of somebody I know who was quarantined, but was taking their dog out for a walk at 2 a.m., which they're not supposed to do. But this is not civil disobedience on a grand scale, is it? This is not poll tax riots or things like that. And I presume the police are reluctant to criminalise things like that. They have discretion. Someone's asking how much discretion the police have in these matters. The answer is quite a lot, I think.
Yeah, discretion is something fundamental to the office of the constable in the UK. But as I say, I think the problem with this is that where we also look at patterns in that data, we find some really troubling data and patterns that relate to ethnicity. You're far more likely to receive an enforcement order. You're far more likely to be on the receiving end of that attention and a lack of discretion if you're from a black and ethnic minority population. And again, that pattern's not new. That pattern was with us before the pandemic. So we need to sort of ask ourselves questions about that, how that operates, why it operates in that way, because you can guarantee that people who live in Kensington are going to get a lot more discretion than people who live in Brixton.
Yes. And as someone who does live in that part of the world, even when I do live in that area, I have very different interactions with the police than some of my neighbours do, and I'm acutely aware of that. I mean, you've actually answered my first question, which is, these are not new, these are an accentuation of things that have been happening. So that does, though, give us a kind of segue into where I want to go. We'll have a couple of extra minutes because of my total technological illiteracy. You did Life Scientific recently, which I must say was jolly good, actually. Well done. But I listened to you, and you said that COVID is the great amplifier of inequalities, not the creator of inequalities, but amplifier of inequalities. So take us through where you think we're going on that, because a couple of people have asked about Black Lives Matter, and I know you've spoken out as well. And you feel, if I interpret you correctly, that actually the pandemic is kind of delaying further problem. I think that's what you're saying, that the problems will you're not optimistic about the future, and not in COVID terms, but in terms of civil order.
Over the short, the medium, and the long term, I think a really good way of anecdotally reflecting on this is the impact on education, school education.
Okay.
So, the lockdown, the closures or whatever, and the access that more affluent children have to IT to maintain their education relative to people from socioeconomic poverty, who live in socioeconomic poverty. So the damage will be long term, that further alienates children from those communities in terms of accessing employment and economic wealth. Now, if we throw into the mix the collapse of the economy that is now going to come globally because of the fact that we are in the economic conditions akin to the Marshall Plan at the end of the Second World War, you've got something really uncomfortable coming up over the horizon that speak to us about widespread unemployment, lack of opportunity, sense of alienation, all the conditions that we know go hand in hand with an uplift in social disorder. Probably got some very, very tricky times coming when we get into the Easter and summer period, where the weather warms up. People are going to come out. People are going to have a sense of, well, there's a vaccine now, isn't there? All of the kinds of things that might flow into a sense of difficulty that's going to become increasingly harder and harder to manage, and is going to leave us with a legacy of deeply embedded inequality. And I think recently we've just seen a report that talks to us about building back better, where we really need to grasp that vision now more than we ever have done before.
That's very well put. Okay, so to end with a couple of things. So I spoke to an assistant commissioner at the Met last night who was very keen to learn, how would you mark the scorecard at the moment? Is this going to be, when looking back on policing and COVID, is this going to be yet another, the miners' strike, Birmingham 6, Scarman, McPherson, etc.? Or do you think, as a seasoned observer of the police, this will go down as a good period?
In policing, you mean?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, like all things, there's good and bad on every scorecard. I mean, it's not a generic look at this, but I mean, in general terms, yeah. I mean, I think things have gone really, really well from a policing perspective thus far. In general terms, it's a question of building on those lessons and understanding more clearly how we can learn from them to manage crises in the future, because being the doom and gloom merchant I actually am,
you are a bit, aren't you?
This is not the end of it. This is the start. Let's not lose sight of the transitions that we need to go through as a function of climate change. all of these kinds of things. We're going to have to go through radical transformations in the way that we live our lives. And that journey is not going to be comfortable. There is going to be confrontation and conflict on that journey. And we need to understand how to manage that in the best possible way that allows us to keep hold of our democracy and keep hold of that idea of policing through consent.
Don't go away, because I need to do a little bit of housekeeping. Then I'm going to come back to you at the end. So we are wrapping up now. And first of all, on behalf of the Royal Society of Medicine, thank you so much for watching this. And my apologies. My New Year's resolution is to learn how to get another computer and learn how that works. You would think I'd have got used to this by now, but I haven't. Now, we're in Tier 3 down in London. That means the little trickle of income that we had at the RSM for our hospitality business has gone the way of all flesh. So once again, if you feel like supporting us, and I'm sure you do at this time of the year, please do, so we can keep this series going. Now, we're having a break now, but we'll be back in the new year on January the 6th. Roger Kirby will be in conversation with Robert Francis, another man with a lot to say on these issues. That's Robert Francis QC of the Mid-Staffs Inquiry. And then I'll be back on January the 7th with this lunchtime series. And of course, we are going back to vaccines. Very nice. Now, some of you have been asking questions about policing, and we'll come back to those on our wrap-up show. But clearly, vaccines are what's obsessing us at the moment. So we'll have Heidi Lawson, hopefully Adam Finn, and a third person there to catch up on what's been happening in the world of vaccines. Now, but back to you for a moment, Cliff. You're also interesting because actually you are the first non-graduate, or originally non-graduate, we've had on this program. I just had a look back, and you've had an interesting past. And I learned from Life Scientific that you became involved really in your earlier days when you almost were on the other side of the barriers. Is that a fair point?
No comment.
Well, you told what's his name now on Life Scientific. So I think it's, but I mean, you have had an astonishing life story. It is amazing, and I'm just so impressed.
Well, yeah, I've certainly had a non-traditional route. Let me put it like that.
Yeah.
A non-traditional route into academia. But I think that I don't think I would be doing the things I'm doing in academia if I hadn't. And I think, you know, I'm at heart an ethnographer, and we know that ethnography is about participant observation, right? So basically, it was through living my life that I began to understand how these dynamics worked. And I think when I reflect back, if I'm going to be honest about these things, why did I get myself into situations of difficulty, shall we call them? It was partly because I was alienated. You know, my head was working. I didn't really probably understand what was happening in my life at that time. And I was a bit rebellious as a function of it, really. I didn't like power. And I didn't like power being exercised over me with illegitimacy, and I fought back. And I think that, you know, that message kind of carries itself into my understanding of how these dynamics work now. And it's because I lived through those dynamics that I began to understand them.
That's a fantastic answer. And Brian Fine, who asked if you actually were a social anthropologist, you're almost, aren't you? An ethnographer is not far off.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, at some level. I mean, we still labour under these really uncomfortable disciplinary boundaries, but we should never lose sight of the primary reason that we have these disciplinary boundaries is because they exist at budget centres in universities, not because our ideas don't have intellectual relevance in different fields of inquiry.
That's a good point. Now, I've given you all our audience an extra 5 minutes to give you your value for money, although of course this is free, because of the technical difficulties or cock-ups I had at my end at the start. But now it is time to finish. It's been a pleasure talking to you. It really has, actually, Cliff. It's been great fun. And I'm sorry about my interruptions, but I don't think it fazed you in the slightest.
No,
and that's absolutely fascinating and something we've not touched on in this series before. So this is our last webinar of the year. I think it's our 55th. We began in the spring and we plodded on through, and we will be back in the new year as the series continues. But looking back, I can see that the very first webinar that we did had a police theme because I remember ending it with a quote from my favorite police show ever, which is, of course, Hill Street Blues, the only one that matters. And I think we might as well end the year, particularly as we look at the rather tricky few weeks that are ahead of us, once again, in the words of Sergeant Pete Esterhouse at the start of every episode of Hill Street Blues, be careful out there. See you all. Have a happy Christmas, happy New Year. Meet you in the new year. Thank you, Cliff.
Thank you.